Wentzel, science and religion conflict, or so believe many people. And there's been great conversations and debates between scientists and theologians, philosophers, etc. I want to get into the way of thinking of each side. How do scientists and theologians think? What are their methodologies? And are they similar, or are they so different that there's really no hope for any sort of real dialogue?
Well, you know, you've used some interesting words there. You've mentioned both science and religion, and you've mentioned science and theology. And I think those are important distinctions. In a broad sense, of course, science and religion are very different issues. And I think one needs to be very specific if you talk about what you're talking about. They are very different things. But it becomes helpful if you do the second thing you just mentioned, which is look at the picture through science and theology. That is a more academic approach in the sense that I would like to do it, which is there are many disciplines out there in the academic world, human sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, philosophy, and various theologies. And I like to come at the issue and trying to deal with this tremendous conflict by understanding that in this interdisciplinary world, in spite of my embracing of some strands of postmodernism and the porousness of the boundaries and how everything often flows together in interdisciplinarity, in spite of all of that, I think we are still at the point where we need to protect the integrity of our various disciplines, and to recognize that disciplines are about different things, use different methodologies, use different criteria. And when you think about that, then science and theology, or any science and theology, are really very different, vastly different kind of strategies, or reasoning strategies, if you want to. So then it would be very easy to construct a situation where there would be in permanent internal conflict. But if one moves up a step from religion in general to specific theologies and specific sciences, then it becomes more tangible. Then we can say, okay, here we have a specific kind of theology or theologian talking to a specific scientist, a cognitive psychologist or a paleoanthropologist or a cosmologist, and then it becomes possible to see how these very different strategies can be brought closer to one another by asking what is it that we do that could be fairly similar. I think we interpret, I think we are solving problems, I think we are dealing with conceptual issues, and in some senses they actually overlap. Like, for instance, on the issue of human uniqueness, which is a term that is used in both theology and in the sciences. So if one follows this kind of trait, then it becomes clearer to how to diffuse a conflict. At some point, one may still reach the point of no return where you want to diverge, but if one sticks to the more generic terminology of, does science and religion, then, as I said in one of my earlier books, it's either a duet or a duel. And there is a complex history about that. But to bring them close to one another, these vastly different cultural forces of science and religion, I find it helpful to do it via the route of specific disciplines. And so go from from religion to theology to specific sciences, and have this in-depth conversation like we've been having here today on those issues. That, I think, is the only way that we can really attempt to have a conversation that would actually advance the interdisciplinary standing of these problems.
I like what you say about each side protecting the integrity of their own discipline. But I would have to say that scientists would counter to that I don't have to worry about protecting the integrity of my discipline from theology. I just ignore it.
Sure.
But from the theological point of view, it's not symmetrical, because that's the problem sometimes. It looks like a symmetrical argument, but scientists would say, I think justifiably so, that it is not symmetrical, that science does not have to consider theology, but theology has to consider science. So how then do you, as a theologian, protect the rational integrity of your discipline, theology, from the methodology of science?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's an important question. And I'll first say again that I think you do this by showing that there's a vast difference between religion as people live it and theology as an academic discipline that is closely conflated with philosophy and other disciplines. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think that is tremendously important is, you are right, they are asymmetrical, but I don't think it's a hierarchy in the sense that science dominates certain methodologies. I think it is clearly true that science has a very impressive history of, and that the empirical nature of science gives us a standing and the spin-off through technology that has changed our lives and our worlds. What I think a theologian should be doing, and that we, in the interdisciplinary conversation, is to show that the disciplines that we are practicing here are philosophically sound, are open for scientific input. And yes, in a generic sense, science may not care about theology, but there are always scientists who are interested, if the theology is good, to have this conversation and say, why are people doing this in a systematic sense, and why are they thinking about issues of the meaning of life and of faith and of evil in a way that might complement the empirical approach of science. Some may and some might not like it, but I do think theologians have a huge epistemic obligation, if I can put it like that, to show that in thinking about this domain of religion through theological disciplines, we have a huge task in trying to foster this interdisciplinary conversation.
So you're protecting the integrity of your discipline, theology, by circumscribing certain kinds of issues that science is unable to deal with.
Yes. But also internally refining the methodology and the conceptuality of what it is we are talking about.
But willing to accept some input from science on each of these things.
Exactly.
But making sure that you don't become overwhelmed in the areas that you've circumscribed.
Yeah. Exactly.
And which would those be? What are those areas that you feel are the domain of theology in which you will accept input, but you will not accept domination?
Well, let me say that I think what is fascinating about the history of modern science, it gives us certain kinds of points of no return. Nobody in his or her right mind is going to argue that the earth is still flat. Nobody is going to argue that, well, of course, people are going to argue it, but I think Darwin has given us a point of no return. I think contemporary cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, there are so many of these things out there that are points of no return that would be nonsensical to pretend that it's not happened, that it's not there. So that is the asymmetricality. I think theology has to be open and realize that science advances to certain points where, even in terms of the epistemic fallibility of science, we get to points of no return. And that is what theology has to incorporate. But to turn that around, I think for someone who cares about deeper spiritual issues, and for someone who cares about the internal issues and ethical dimensions of religion, I think those are not, I don't want to insulate them from science, but I would say this is a domain. There is a domain here of ethics, a domain of a deeper spirituality that is well cared for if the theology is done well, and that I'm hoping that at least some scientists would respect. So that kind of conceptuality and trying to reflect about what it is in theology that would give us a clearer insight in why people care about the meaning of life, and the meaning of the world. I think that is the domain of theology and actually of philosophy too. And that should be upheld and should not be denigrated by empiricist or reductionist methodologies.